Welcome to the second climate change webinar brought to you by the U.S. Heartland China Association in collaborations with the University of Denver and the Carter Center. I'm Sophia Sun from the U.S. Heartland China Association, a bipartisan nonprofit committed to promoting healthy relations between the U.S. and China with a special focus on American Heartland region we serve. Some housekeeping items. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen to submit questions. And before you leave today, after the webinar, please fill out the survey for us. Thank you. To help us kick off today's event, we have with us the chairman and the CEO of USHCA, Bob Holden, to give us opening remarks. Governor Holden, your remarks, please.
Thank you very, very much. And I appreciate all of you being here. As I said earlier, this could not be a more important issue than what you're addressing for not only Colorado, the United States, but the world. And I appreciate the leadership that you're taking. Climate change and lowering the greenhouse gas emission is extremely important. And President Biden has also set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by the year 2030. Many of the scientists are telling us that if we don't address this issue very, very quickly and appropriately, that in the next 20 years or so, it'll be too late. We would have caused to go over the cliff. Now, I hope that's not true, but they're saying by 2030, we've got to have some serious changes in what we're doing. 20 of the warmest 22 years in our globe have occurred in these last 20 years. So all the scientists are telling us that we're running out of time. And that's the reason this program this evening is so very, very important, because not only do we need to communicate with young people, but we need to communicate with our entire population. The 20th warmest years have occurred in, as I said, in these last 22 years. More than 1 million species are at risk of extinction if we don't reverse the effort. Higher temperatures, worsening air quality, and impacting crop production, all are creating a disastrous set of circumstances for us as a state, country, region, and a globe. So it's on all of our behalf that we must address this issue. China is a leading emitter of greenhouse gas, but the United States is number 2, followed by European Union, Russia, Japan, India, and Canada. This accounts for about 70% of the energy-related emissions since 2009. So you can see how rapidly all of this is impacting all of us. I was just on a Zoom early this morning with Rodney Slater, who was in part of the administration much earlier in our stay. He was with President Clinton when he was president of the United States, and we had the similar discussion. So I very much appreciate the fact that you're taking the lead at your university and your state on this issue. It's very, very important. And John Kerry couldn't be a better person for doing this. I mean, I had the opportunity to briefly interact with then presidential candidate Kerry many years ago. And this is an issue that he's truly committed to and working for. And so is President Biden. So I think we've got the team in place in leadership in Washington, D.C. to actually get some things accomplished. I've been very pleased with the commitment on infrastructure funding and those things, and not just the road and the bridges and things, even though that is very important, but they're also talking about broadband and technology and all of the other aspects that I think is so very important to all of us as we put all this together. So I'm delighted to be with all of you this evening. Thank you for all that you're doing and commitment. And I look forward to working with you as our organization and your university in the months and years ahead, because you really bring some top flight leadership to this cause. And I very much appreciate it. And our organization very much appreciate it. So good luck, and let me know how I can be helpful to all of you in what you're doing.
Thank you, Governor Holden. Now let's welcome Yawei Liu, our board member and senior advisor from the Carter Center, to give his remarks.
Thanks, Sophia. It is great to work with the U.S. Heartland China Association and the University of Denver. It's great to meet Atlanta native Dean Mayer, Paige Alexander, CEO of the Carter Center, and Barbara Smith, Vice President of Peace Programs at the Carter Center, asked me to extend their greetings to the panelists and all the audience. I have three quick points to make. Number one is about President Carter. President Carter was the first American president to realize how serious climate change is a threat to the humanity. While he was the president, just keep in mind when he was president from 1977 to 1981. His Presidential Council on Environmental Quality issued 3 reports on climate change. And one of the recommendations is to get industrialized nations to be aware in terms of how much carbon dioxide they're going to release. And also the recommendation said limit global average temperature to 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, precisely the standard agreed to by the nations of the world 35 years later, when the Paris Climate Agreement was reached in 2015. You probably all remember in 1979, President Carter put solar panel on the West Wing of the White House. When President Reagan moved in, his chief of staff, Donald Reagan, told everyone that was a joke, and they quickly removed the polar panel from there. Just remember, this was in 1977. Governor Holden was talking about how much time that we have to deal with this. But basically 12 years after President Carter was defeated, the entire that time was lost. And after that, 27 some years, both parties that they worked on and off until President Donald Trump came into the White House, and he basically stopped the US involvement in climate change. The second point I want to make, which is, I think, also fit into the bigger picture of US-China relationship, that is the reversal of roles. Now, initially, when China was invited to be part of the global campaign to arrest climate change, China saw that as a vast Western conspiracy to stop China's development. Now, back in 2014, President Trump, then a private citizen, he sent out a tweet, I quote, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive." And he followed through on what he tweeted in 2014. That reverse of the role, because China was very reluctant. You probably also remember at the Copenhagen meeting, President Obama barged into the conference room where Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao was discussing with his advisors, and President Obama wanted China to come on board, and China was very reluctant to do that. Number 3 is that I wonder, and this is a very timely discussion because I think the experts on the panel probably is going to give a lot of attention to this issue, particularly Professor Qi Ye. I remember you were one of the authors in that book, Debating China, You and Kelly Gallagher debated, on what role China could play, what role US could play, and how cooperative US and China could be. I would like you to sort of address whether that debate is still raging, or that debate is behind us. But I think at the context of this very poisoned bilateral relationship, whether US and China could move into very close and coordinated cooperation, that's really a challenge. I just want to give you two examples. The first example is John Kerry, President Joe Biden's climate envoy, announced last week that the US administration is mulling over sanctions on China's imported solar panels and related technology because these solar panels might be manufactured by forced labor in Xinjiang. See, that's another hurdle, is the politicization of everything now in the context of US-China relationship. The second example is just this Tuesday when President Biden went to Detroit at the Ford plant. And he talked about electric vehicles that Jennifer was discussing. And he said, China is leading the whole world in battery. He did not criticize China directly, but he did implicitly criticize China, saying, China did not have that technology. It was suggesting indirectly that China has stolen that technology, that China is leading and China is exporting electric vehicles all over the world with the sights on the US. This kind of rhetoric from American leaders certainly is not going to be very conducive to a US-China collaboration. I think the title of today's webinar is very appropriate. So I look very much forward to the experts on the panel to talk about how and if US and China could collaborate in climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yahweh. To lead us through the rest of the programs today is Suisheng Zhao, our strategic advisor and professor and director of the Center for China-US Cooperation at Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, the University of Denver. So now I will turn this over to Professor Zhao.
Thank you, Sophia. And I want to also take this opportunity to thank Governor Holden for your leadership of the US-China Heartland China Association, which has established its reputation as a leading NGO in the US and also known in China to promote mutual understanding and the collaboration between these two countries. I still remember our first meeting together, China Center. We host a conference in Beijing together with the China Association for the promotion of friendship. And you talked about how important the heartland part of US in this relationship. Since then, we have worked together on many events. And also I would thank your staff, especially Dr. Fan Ming and Sophia, for their able work to make these collaborations possible. And also I want to thank Yahweh, my dear friend, for how many years we have collaborated for so many projects. And the Carter Center has also played such an important leadership role to promote understanding and collaboration. And I'm so happy that President Carter has also been a leader in the green energy issue front. I heard that first time today. Thank you for telling us those stories. And before I start the whole program, I want to make a personal statement here. We all know that President Joe Biden today signed an anti-Asian hate crime bill. I'm very excited for the bill, not only because I've been an Asian American and sometimes victim of the anti-Asian hate, but also I feel very strongly that as a China scholar doing research in the US-China relations, we have the obligation to be guarded against the tendency to use China as a scapegoat for our own domestic problems in the US and demonize Chinese and Asian Americans. In fact, yesterday I had a joint meeting with Jennifer's colleague, Rob Daly. And he said that he will mention this issue at every US-China relations event. I was really impressed by what he said yesterday. And so I'm proud to follow his example to make this statement today. This is my first one. I will make that statement every event. And as Governor Holden and Dr. Liu Yawei mentioned, that the climate change issue has been such a crucial issue for the both US and China. In fact, I will add that this issue is the next to nuclear weapons has the potential of a mutual destruction. So we have to understand the issue and also find how we can resolve this potential danger. I mean, prevent it from destroying the human being. And US used to be the largest carbon emitter, but China has exceeded the United States. In fact, Governor Holden mentioned earlier that China is the largest emitter today. Just a couple of weeks ago, a Rhodium group published that annual report. China now emitted 29% of total global emission. US now is a far second, 11%. US has been doing much better in that case. But third is India. Governor Holden talked about the EU. EU is number 4. And so all the larger countries have been responsible for the emissions. And this report was published just after a very important summit hosted by President Biden last month, in which Chinese President Xi Jinping attended and once again committed that China will peak its emission by 2030 and have carbon zero, I mean, neutral by 2060. And also he promised to have, in fact, he said China looks forward to working with the international community, including the United States, to joint advance global environment governance. And before this meeting, we all know John Kerry, as Governor Holden mentioned, that went to China and met with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua. And they had very good meetings and also issued a joint statement in Shanghai, which begins with that the United States and China are committed to cooperating with each other and with other countries to tackle the climate crisis, which must be addressed with the seriousness and urgency that it demands. Now the issue becomes how can these two countries collaborate on these issues? What are the challenges that these two countries have faced? And how can they overcome those challenges? So these are the issues we are going to discuss. In fact, we are going to divide the issues into 4 aspects. One is the domestic challenges. Second is at industrial sectors or areas that is the focus of each country. Then what are the collaboration opportunities? Then the fourth, what are the obstacles? We have assembled a very, very distinguished panel with scholars from both the US and China. Normally I will not give a detailed introduction to their bios, but I think these people are so impressive. I would spend a little bit time to give a little bit more introductions to each of the panelists. We'll start from Dean Fritz Meyer of the Joseph Colbert School of International Studies. Dean Meyer's research interests include international trade and economic globalization, and the role of the storytelling in politics and collective action. He published 2 single-authored books for education publications and numerous articles and chapters on many important political economy issues, including climate change and environmental issues. Prior to come to DU, Dean Meyer served as professor of public policy, political science and environment, associate dean and director of Center for Political Leadership, Innovation and Service, and director of the program on global policy and governance at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And then from America side, we have a very distinguished colleague, Dr. Jennifer Turner, who has been the director of the China Environmental Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center for 18 years, where
21 years.
21, those are the old resume you gave us. But 21 years, very impressive. She creates meetings, exchanges, and publications focusing on a variety of energy and environmental challenges facing China, particularly on water, energy, and green civil society issues. She leads the Wilson Center's Global Choke Point Initiative, which together with Circle of Blue has produced multimedia reports, films, and conventing on water, energy, food confrontations in China, India, Mexico, South Africa, and the United States. And she has also many other initiatives. I don't want to read that anymore, too impressive. Now, on China side, we have 2 specialist scholars, distinguished scholars. Dr. Qi Ye, or in the US we'll say Ye Qi, is the distinguished professor of environmental policy and management at the Tsinghua University School of Public Policy and Management since 2004. By the way, Tsinghua University is the top university in China, just like MIT in this country, very top university. Before he joined Tsinghua, he was a Chung Kong Chair, Professor of Environmental Science at Beijing Normal University. Taking the special endowed professorship, Dr. Qi returned to China in 2003 from University of California, Berkeley, where she taught ecosystem management, forest management, and climate change science at Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management from 1996 through 2003. A long career in the US, moved back to China. And Dr. Qi's research areas include climate change, impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, global and regional carbon cycling, environmental and resource policy for sustainable development, ecosystem management. And Dr. Qi lead numerous research projects with awards in research grant from NSF, National Science Foundation, NASA, DOE, NOAA, USDA, and the Ministry of Science Technology of China, Ministry of Education China. He published many books and articles, and also have a public service in the academic, government, and also professional associations. I don't want to read there, so many. Now, last but not least, Professor Yongsen Zhang, or Zhang Yongsen in Chinese. Professor Zhang is a senior research fellow and director of Research Institute for Eco-Civilization at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. By the way, this is the premier think tank in China. Prior to joining CAS in 2019, he was the chief expert on green development, a senior research fellow at Development Research Center of the State Council, where I worked before I came to the United States, 1980s, many years. He is a special advisor of China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. His research is mainly focused on ecological civilization, environmental, ecological economics, green development, and Chinese economy. In recent years has been doing systemic, theoretical, and policy research on green development in the perspective of redefining development and explore its new policy implications for environment and development. And thank you for bearing with me for the non-introduction, because I think this is very important to understand these distinguished scholars and their views. So we'll start from the two Chinese scholars each has about 5 minutes or so to talk about these domestic challenges and what are those sectorial collaboration possible, and also what are the opportunities for these two countries to collaborate, and also the barriers. So Dr. Qi Ye and Dr. Zhang, who among yourself to start? Let me get the
Professor Qi first. Yeah.
Dr. Zhang, you can start. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Zhao, for your introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's my great honor to be part of this wonderful event organized by U.S. Heartland China Association and Denver University. I think this kind of conversation between American and Chinese scholars are very hopeful, not just for the two countries, but also for the world. I have two messages as my opening remarks. The first message is that there are so many business opportunities for the two countries to collaborate on climate change. In China, to achieve a carbon neutrality target, there are multi-billion-dollar investment opportunities in new energy, electric vehicle, green infrastructure. If the US and China can work together, it would definitely be a win-win situation. The second message is that many American people don't know that China is actually one of the countries trying the hardest to fighting climate change, and China is so serious to its commitment to carbon neutrality. The reason why China goes to carbon neutrality is not because of international pressure, but I think green is the future, and going green could be an opportunity. So it's in China's own interest. That means that no matter if the USA or other countries go to net zero emissions, China will anyway go to net zero. So many years ago, like almost all other countries, China thought that environmental protection was conflicting to its economic growth, and its priority is to grow its economy first and clean up later. But now China has realized that the traditional growth model is unsustainable, and the green transition represents a huge opportunity. So green development and carbon neutrality have become China's development strategy. China's policy on carbon neutrality will be stable, consistent, and level back and forth. I hope the two messages are hopeful for us to discuss the collaboration between the two countries. Yeah, Professor Zhao. Yeah.
So
yes.
You just stop here, or you want to?
This is just the opening remarks. If you want to go to, yeah, I would like to talk.
You still
more
have time, not the 5 minutes yet.
Okay, so you mentioned that what's the domestic challenges are there for each country to achieve its commitment. now I think, because you know, China is an economy. China is heavily relies on the fossil fuel. Now China turn its enormous economy away from fossil fuels and achieve a carbon neutral economy while maintain a relatively high growth rate. So this is I think is a big challenge here, because you know that fossil fuel accounts for about 85%, and China has to dramatically reduce its fossil fuel. It's a big challenge indeed, but we actually don't really worry about economic growth here. Three reasons here. First is that we no longer think environmental protection is conflicting to economic growth. Rather, it can improve economic quality and become a source of economic growth. Yeah. During the 13th five-year plan period, or the last 5 years, China took very strong environmental action, and its environmental has been substantially improved, but its economic growth is one of the highest in the world. Yeah. The second is that the renewable energy increases very fast in China. It will finally replace fossil fuels by 2060s. Now, fossil fuel accounts for about 85% or something, and non-fossil fuel accounts for only about 15%, but non-fossil fuel increases very quickly, yeah, especially after China announced the 2060 carbon neutrality target. If we assume that renewable energy gets doubled every 5 years or something, then the share of renewable energy will increase very quickly in China. If you look at solar energy, wind energy, electric vehicles, you can see that huge opportunities are emerging, and they are a new driver of economic growth. Yeah. So though we don't really worry about the economic growth in the transition, we do worry about the transition justice, since some areas, industries, groups will be particularly impacted negatively. So, for instance, millions of people work in coal or heavy industries. The government, especially the central government, should make specific plans to help them, including fiscal transfer payments, training, green infrastructure investment, social security. Yeah. So this is a big challenge. Yeah. Professor Zhao. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for very punctual at the time. So now, Dr. Qi.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhao. Good evening and good morning, everyone. So great to see all of you on screen. I hope one day soon we can see you in person. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the organizers for having me here. It's really, truly a great honor to be with you. Particularly, I would like to thank the U.S. Heartland China Association and for your kind invitation. And I really like your logo of broad pathway and colorful rainbow there. And I very much agree with you. Not all bridges are built with cement and steel. Some bridges are built with friendship and cultural communion. Actually, I like the latter better because it's low carbon and it is climate friendly. Let me just try to touch upon two issues. First, can US and China collaborate on climate change? Then I will talk a little bit about domestic challenges within China. The first question, to answer the first question, is not always easy. And it's getting hard over time. Definitely we should and we could collaborate on this very important issue, the common and greatest challenge to the humanities. But it is extremely hard. You can actually ask a similar question. Can the Democrats and Republicans collaborate on climate change within the United States? I think the answer is obvious, right? Then what is interesting now is increasingly we have seen across the world, it seems we have already, or we are building a consensus on the issue of climate change. This new consensus is around the concept of carbon neutrality or climate neutrality or net carbon emissions. And this is particularly true ever since September 22nd. Last year, after the Chinese President Xi Jinping made the announcement to the UN General Assembly, and that China will work hard to achieve the carbon peak before 2030 and the carbon neutrality before 2060. And before that, the EU and the member states are probably the only countries who have declared this climate neutrality goals. But after that, now we have seen somewhere between 40 to 120 countries that have made the similar announcement with a different kind of understanding, interpretation, and definition of it. But I think this is really a growing consensus around the carbon neutrality. Is really, really exciting. Then I think, by the end of this year, when all countries get together at Glasgow in the UK for the COP26, if we can consolidate and institutionalize this consensus, I think it would be a major achievement. With that being said, ironically, we see the international consensus, but domestically, it is still very, very challenging to build consensus within each country, in the United States and in China alike. Right? So I think that is really what is a major obstacle we need to break, and we need to develop and build a consensus within, while we're building consensus among the countries. It is particularly difficult now because of this political atmosphere, this general environment. They're not really cooperating. While John Kerry and Xie Jinping were meeting just a month ago, and the 16th, 17th in Shanghai, and to engage a dialogue on climate change cooperation. And the U.S. Senate was just introduced and adopted this Strategic Competition Act. I mean, this act, according to some think tank veterans in Washington, D.C., and if passed, it will be a de facto declaration of a Cold War with China. So this is the kind of obstacle. It's not decreasing, but growing. So this should concern all of us, in order for us to really develop a cooperative and a collaborative environment, for issues like climate change, like the COVID-19 pandemic. So this general atmosphere is not really the cooperating at this moment. However, I think a lot of the things, other aspects of the issue is really changing so much. Just recall 20 years ago when President George W. Bush just made the announcement to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, right? And he cited a couple of reasons. One, China was not certain. Two, some developing countries like China and India not really making their own share of carbon reduction. And three, the combating on climate change is going to hurt the economy. A lot of people didn't really like the action of President Bush's withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol, but basically he was true. I mean, he was right in the understanding. Back then, our economies are so much reliant, dependent on the fossil fuel combustion. But now things have changed and changed so much. And Yahweh just mentioned President Carter, put a solar panel on the White House over there. And it was really a great action and moral and political leadership of his to do so. But we have to realize, 40-some years ago, you put a solar panel over there, it will be 100 times as costly as it is today. Today, you spend a small fraction of the money, and you can put the solar panel not only on the White House, but on any house, in China and in the United States. Well, that is the true progress of the technology that have made just within decades, even within years. So that actually stimulated the market to play its decisive role in pushing for this low carbon transition of the economy in the United States and also in China. I think that is also the basis for this announcement to make the carbon neutrality real and credible. And we have already, over the last 20 years, we have seen the narrative on climate change have changed so much from the time at the beginning. And we think the climate change, action on climate change will hurt the economy. Now we think action on climate change is essential to drive the growth of the economy. It's actually the new driver for economic growth. I think that is the kind of understanding and consensus that being built within countries and across countries. I'm very hopeful. I think that's the very basis for the cooperation between the two countries. So I think there are two fronts that are critically important at the moment. Well, the easier part is probably on trade, right? When just like, each party can gain economically, financially from trade, and each party can actually gain from the climate change, from this decarbonization benefit. So this second is on the technology. The recent report that confirmed some assertion of many, including Bill Gates in his new book. The new report just recently released last week, just 2 days ago, by the International Energy Agency. In this report, it's estimated to have 50% of the technology is still need to be developed in order to achieve a carbon neutrality by mid-century. So that means none of the countries can actually achieve their goal for carbon neutrality independently. And the best way would be, we work together. Let's work together on technological innovation to achieve that. So I think those two areas are the most critical for both countries. But in order for those to happen, I think this communication and among the people and between this non-governmental organization like yours will actually help to facilitate and to drive this kind of communication and cooperation to happen. Finally, let me just say a couple of words about the domestic challenges within China to achieve carbon peak and the carbon neutrality. In fact, I think carbon peak by 2030 is not going to be a big problem at all. If we just keep growing with the share of non-fossil fuel, which is about somewhere between 15 and 16% right now of all primary energy consumption. And we just keep limiting the overall consumption of energy. By 2030, if the total energy consumption is within 5.5 billion tons coal equivalent, I think the carbon peak is not going to be a problem. However, carbon neutrality is going to be a huge challenge for China by 2060. Why? Well, first of all, the time left for between the carbon peak and the carbon neutrality is very short. Look around the world. The EU, 60 years, UK, 70 years, US, 45 years, and China, 30 years. And that also related to the overall size of the carbon emission, the total carbon emissions. China is just about twice as much of the United States, 3 times as much as the EU. So that makes it extremely difficult. I think the challenge is not just the technology or not just the economic, the financing part. And although we do realize 2% to 2.5% of the GDP is needed to invest for the transition of the energy system alone, and that itself is a huge challenge. But compared to the factor that Professor Zhang just mentioned, this is a huge transition, unprecedented in China and in the world. Huge transition of the society and even have great implication on the political system, because this will involve losers and winners on the business side and also on the employee side. And if not managed well, and this could create a social instability, a huge risk for the political system. So it has to be handled extremely well. Let me just stop over here, and I look forward to more discussion. Thank you, Professor Zhao.
Thank you, Dr. Qi, for your very insightful discussion and also recommendations, and also talking about the challenges. Now, I will invite Dr. Jennifer Turner to respond, because she studies China's environmental issue, what those objectives and their talk about those challenges realistic. Then I invite our Dean Mayer to talk from American perspective. Dr. Turner.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so well, I mean, in my job, for 21 years, I've been having a front row seat, kind of working with government, NGO, business, and researchers in the US and China, looking at, the trends, the cooperation, the challenges. One thing, that the kind of the foundation of my project really started with my very first policy brief back in 2001, and it kind of sums up the theme you're interested here today. The policy brief was called Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential, US Energy and Environmental Cooperation. And that the idea that, and we're seeing that today, because Dr. Leo said at the beginning, oh, the political tension, everyone kind of alludes to it. But from where I sit and have interacted with people, even when the relationship was really in rough shape, and it's happened again and again, the kind of environmental climate diplomacy, this kind of collaboration, this channel has kept open. One quick example, right after I started at the Wilson Center, in 1999, on May 7th, there was that incident where the US dropped a bomb on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, right? Well, the very next week, the head of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration in DC was supposed to go to China to do a 2-week visit to climate researchers and meteorological, but it was mainly for climate. And he called his counterparts in China. He said, with the bombing incident, they said, "You guy lie, you should come." And so he still went. And I've seen this again and again, that despite, the US and China, we can argue and chew gum at the same time, that we still see this, the climate and energy collaboration can move forward. I want to just switch quickly, let's talk a little, because I think that Dr. Zhang and Dr. Qi have covered kind of like the big overarching kind of themes. And I want to go a little bit more micro in the topic of electric vehicles, all right? Kind of thinks about the market issue. When she last year announced that by 2035, China is going to phase out internal combustion engine cars, that they're not going to be selling them new anymore. And it's a beautiful example of, yet again, just like solar PV panels, where China lit a match on the global market. And should stress though that, China, while China appears to be the leader, right? They produce, I think they have 50% of the electric vehicles on the road. Get this, 97% of the electric buses in the world. Ooh, China, you're always number one. But it's really two governments in the world that are the game changers, China and California, right? Because China has, while they've produced this, electric vehicle miracle from a lot of subsidies, a little bit of that, environmental authoritarianism that the Chinese Communist Party and government has. But now they realize that they really do need a market. And so they turn to California's zero emission vehicle program, which is using credits where electric vehicle companies, car producers have to pay, they're supposed to produce a certain number of cars, or they're going to have to pay a credit, and China is modeling on this, which also, besides producing the vehicles, they also, both in US, China's following the California example that they also have to have, all cars have to have better fuel efficiency standards. So there is this intertwining of the two. And you could even say, like, in the electric vehicle sector, I mean, it is a race to the top. Maybe we can even think of it kind of like a, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like a climate change space race between the two countries. So right now, China's got more those electric vehicle wheels on the ground, and the US lags behind. I mean, President Biden has said, we're going to invest, $174 billion in electric vehicles. That's great. But the US does have some strengths in some of the innovation, and notably the one area that I think we are, if we have to be ahead, we could say the vehicle to grid type technologies. And so this is encouraging, and it was already mentioned, I think, by both Dr. Zhang and Xie. The global energy market is plenty big for both countries to just be crazy in terms of producing lots of products and innovating. I just bring up the electric vehicle example. In the Q&A, we could talk more that there are other areas where we could have kind of a race to the top, so to speak. It may sound funny, but energy efficient buildings. I mean, globally, 70% of the CO2 emissions are related to buildings, both the construction and the running of them, heating, cooling, lighting. And China, 70% of their CO2 is linked to building energy, and US is 36. And so this is an area where particularly it got very intense in a good way, but under the Obama administration, there was a lot of building energy efficiency cooperation. And some of that still could be moving forward. You might even think of it like, like we could be going in parallel, but there's a lot of good kind of technologies that can be shared. I'm really cognizant of our time and want to make sure that we get to the Q&A. So, but want to toss out there that note that the electric vehicles, green transport, green buildings were part of that statement that Carrie and Xie Zhenhua, helped broker a couple of weeks ago. But there was another topic that is kind of a new one that I'm intrigued with, the idea of green and climate resistant agriculture. And I think that particularly because, I'm here with the Heartland US Heartland China Association, the Heartland in America, that we should pay attention to this, because that is an area that when we're talking concern about, we think about the energy transition, just energy transition. Well, let's not leave the rural areas in our two countries behind in this transition, but also we need to address there are growing CO2 emissions that come from the ag sector. And we could talk more about that later, but I'm gonna pass the virtual microphone over to Dean Mayer now, because he does storytelling, and I want to hear stories.
Very lovely stories. Now we have Dean Mayer from American perspective.
Well, thank you, Professor Zhao, and thank you to the U.S. Heartland China Association. It's an honor to be with all of you today. I'm sure I'll learn more than I'll share. I'm going to pull back a bit, actually, and try to frame out what I see as the big issues on the central question here, which is really whether China and the U.S. Can cooperate on climate change. And let me start with the challenges, because I will come to why I'm also optimistic as my fellow panelists are, but I do want to emphasize some of the challenges. And so let's start with the current state of bilateral relations. It is true, and I'll make a similar point as Dr. Turner just made, that we can, chew gum and cooperate at the same time, I think was what you said. But
we could argue and chew gum.
Argue and chew gum, right? I got to get the metaphor right. Nonetheless, there are tensions between the governments, and Professor Chi mentioned them. The legislation in the U.S. Congress, language that is used by people who are unaware of how it might be perceived on the other side. There are significant tensions between the countries at this moment, and the question is ultimately whether we can decouple the conversation around climate change from these other issues. And while it is said we can, nonetheless, it surely colors the relationship. And it, in many ways, the Chinese government is less interested in decoupling than perhaps the US government is, for reasons of trying to reduce the pressures they're getting on other fronts. So that's a challenge. A second, China and the US are engaged in a vast geopolitical rivalry at this point. And the two countries, well, they certainly share interests, and I'll talk about them, but nonetheless, we're in something of a global contest for leadership on multiple fronts, on the economic front, on the security front. And of course, those color the bilateral relationships, but the two countries on some dimensions don't share interests, are in competition fundamentally with each other for primacy in various spheres and for leadership positions in the international system. So that's a challenge. I think there remains still a challenge in the, let's call it the fundamental framing of the issue. It is certainly the case that China has surpassed the US as an emitter. And that's a point the US makes always. The United States always begins with the present and looks to the future. And in some sense, in US politics, and this comes now to some of the domestic, the US sees China as the problem looking forward. Well, China, rightly, historically has pointed to China, the climate debt, the history of this issue, the extent to which still it is the case that the US is responsible for more of the carbon load than China, although the gap is narrowing rapidly, I believe. But nonetheless, this is the fundamental argument of historically of developing countries. And I think that framing remains important. And of course, it is the case now that that China has committed to peak by 2030, and perhaps may be able to do it earlier and be carbon neutral by 2060, of course. But nonetheless, there remains the sense, I think, in China. I'd be very interested, obviously, in my Chinese colleagues' reaction to this, that the U.S. bears historical responsibility, a sense that is not shared by Americans typically. So those are challenges. And let me name two more, and they really relate to whether each side can actually deliver on the commitments. I agree that there's an emerging consensus in the world around carbon neutrality as the goal. I mean, it really is quite remarkable. The point was very well made. But I would say, and again, a question perhaps for my Chinese colleagues is, while it is the case that China is moving rapidly on non-fossil fuels, it is also continuing to build coal plants at a fairly rapid pace. I mean, at more than the rest of the world combined. And those power plants have very long lives. They will be in operation for some time. So there's a question, I think, certainly from a U.S. perspective, as to whether China, notwithstanding its public commitments and the momentum it has in non-fossil fuels and renewables, will be able to wean itself from reliance on coal as it continues to build new coal-fired plants at a pretty fast clip. A related issue has to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is seen by many in the US, skeptically for many reasons, but in part as encouraging a fossil fuel development in many places in the world. And I think, there's a fair critique in the early stages of the Belt and Road Initiative that was the case, encouraging investments in coal-driven power in developing countries. That may be changing, and so it'd be interesting to talk about that. So I think that's a challenge. And then there's the United States and the question of whether we can deliver. And there's a good reason to be skeptical. I'm very positive about what is happening in the Biden administration, but I worked in the US Senate, part of my biography that we didn't hear some time ago, admittedly, but I followed the politics of the US pretty closely. And this is a tough issue. And the jury is out on whether President Biden will be able to make good on the intentions that he has. Some of them are more promising than others. The investment side of things, the carrot side, is more likely than the stick side. That is to say, although there'll be regulatory actions taken by the Biden administration, the ability of the US to pass any significant legislation, a carbon tax, for example, is very, very, very difficult. And it's not clear that the president will be able to get anything at the scope that he hopes for out of the infrastructure bill, which is in some ways a green bill. And so there's that question. And then, of course, there's the sort of other meta question, which is, I think, perhaps looking from the Chinese perspective, the U.S. is ping pong back and forth from going back to President Carter to President Reagan, and then et cetera, as we switch administrations. We've of course just come out of 4 years of President Trump. Now we have President Biden, but will it last? And is it sustainable? And I don't know the answer to that question, but there's reason to be skeptical of that, or to worry about that. The midterm elections in the US coming up, I would have to bet that Republicans will take control of the House. The Senate hangs in the balance. Who knows what will happen in the next presidential election, but it is possible that the US, having all this enthusiasm and energy, is unable to sustain it. And so I think that's a major challenge. So that's the glass half empty. But I agree with my colleagues. I mean, there is, if the fundamental question is, can the US and China cooperate? The answer is yes. I mean, in part because we have to. Both countries have a stake in this, enormous stake in this. And so the question, I don't think, is whether we'll cooperate, but in what form and what are the most promising avenues. And I'll just cite a couple and then I'll stop and we can talk about in Q&A. I don't think in the short run we're going to see, let's call it a high politics, public partnership, the two of us side by side announce. There are many reasons for that, but that's quite difficult. But cooperation doesn't require that you do that. There are a lot of ways to cooperate. And I expect, certainly on the US side, the US is very much interested in revitalizing our relationships with the EU and other historical allies on this issue and many others. And I would expect that it will be much easier to cooperate in a multilateral forum than in a bilateral forum. And so, I think that's the US strategy in any event. It's more effective at putting pressure to the extent pressure is needed, but also it's more palatable, I would think, to China and easier to imagine it happening. So I think that's a significant pathway, and that's certainly the US strategy. Second, this is a point Dr. Turner made as well, intergovernmental subnational cooperation continues, and it has, and it will. at multiple levels. You know, the history of sort of technical bureaucratic cooperation is pretty thick, and there may have been some damage done to that in the last 4 years, probably so, but I suspect that that will continue. And that, you know, there's a lot that happens in policy below the high profile media coverage stuff. And so I think that's important. Third, I think the momentum in green tech and in technology is tremendous. And it's interesting because in this realm, in a sense, competition between the two countries leads to a kind of a form of cooperation. So if you think about green development, which I know Dr. Zhang writes about, you know, there may well be a race to the top or to the greener pasture as both countries compete to develop the technologies and to encourage markets in developing countries on a greener path. And so we could talk more about that, but I do see a convergence here and while it's competitive at one level, both the market continues to develop and each is spurring it on in its own way. And then the last thing I'll point to, and a point I think Professor Chi made earlier, is that this new consensus, while it's not universal in either country, there is a pressure from society ultimately, and that's not going to become less over time. And so each government has to be responsive to its citizenry. I follow U.S. politics more obviously than China, but we're at a much better place than we were a decade ago in the United States. Yes, there's still climate skeptics. Yes, there's still lots of opposition, but public opinion has really come around. I mean, we're no longer seriously debating whether it's happening. That issue is increasingly settled. And I think that pressure from society, presumably in both countries, will help over the longer term in any event to encourage cooperation, notwithstanding the obstacles I began with. Well, let me stop there. A lot of territory obviously covered, but look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dean Meyer, for the very comprehensive coverage of the issues and positive about the possibility of collaboration. In fact, I think all the panelists are very positive on the possibilities of collaboration. So the issues, now let's move on to the dialogue, to the conversation about the 4 issues. I want to combine the first 2 issues together. And we have the conversation among the panelists. Each just can jump in at a time and just have a quick comments or ask each other on the questions. That's the way I think we will have another next half hour before we open the floor to the audience. The first 2 questions here, I think, are very similar, given this type of possibility of collaboration and also ambitious of the leadership on both sides to work together to overcome the climate change problems. But there are so many domestic challenges on both sides. I think for American side, other than those economic technical issues, the politics, I think, might be the most challenging aspect, as we all understand. And also, Dean Meyer mentioned the cycles of the elections. How could this cycle of elections put a challenge to the climate change if, for example, in the midterm election, the Republicans, as Dean Meyer mentioned, that gained majority in the House and also possibly in the Senate. could that become a constraint to Joe Biden's climate change policy? And how could the international community trust America in that case, in the long run, for the climate change commitment by Joe Biden? And also on the American side, another political issue here is that the US has put China in a rivalry, not only rivalry, sometimes as an enemy of US essential threat. And as Dr. Qi mentioned at the US Senate, they just passed the Strategic Competition Act, which has singled out one country, in fact, as a threat to US long-term security and well-being. And this is supported by both parties. I just read an article yesterday, was very interesting. Only those progressive section of Democrats are opposing that. So this is the very interesting dynamics of American politics. So given those dynamics, how could US make sure, I mean, could international community be assured that US would be a good player in the climate change front? For the Chinese side, I think both our scholars have very good discussion about the Chinese commitment and the Chinese progress. Here, I want you to talk a little bit about specifics. What have China planned? Those policies, such as mentioned, I think Jennifer mentioned that in the carbon credit system. I read quite a few articles on the China just didn't learn from the US and how that carbon credit system is established, how that works, that working in China well. And what Dr. Qi mentioned about the challenges for only 30 years to reach neutral. So what are the specific plans of China to reach that neutral goal? So maybe American side could talk first, Dr. Turner and Dean Mayer, who
Well, I'll touch on one thing when you talk about the up and down, and Dean Mayer also talked about this, our politics going up and down. But think in terms, again, like I mentioned, that in the environmental space, that okay, under Clinton and Gore was the one that catalyzed it was the first time we had a high-level multi-agency cooperation around environment and climate issues. G.W. Bush comes in, boom, shuts down. And so for 8 years, if we talk about same bed, different dream, we were sleeping in different beds, right? There was no common dream here on climate at all. But the US foundations, a lot of the NGOs started, and think tanks, we got a lot of people here. I think Chie, he's come and spoken for me. Dr. Zhang has come and spoken for me. Dean Mayer, we got to get you in at some point. So there's been a lot of interaction, and groups like Natural Resources Defense Council, they set up an office in China, as did the Energy Foundation. And you can see their fingerprints on a lot of China's, clean energy legislation. And so that's why when President Obama came in and people that weren't like nerdy China people like us, said like, wow, suddenly there's 9 clean energy agreements. Like, well, there was a lot of work over many years from the universities and the researchers and the NGOs to keep this relationship going. But I have to say that there is a challenge right now that, and I'm curious, that from the Chinese side on this non-governmental type of cooperation is the NGO registration law. I mean, some of the US, the big groups, the NRDC, WWFs, and they've been able to register, but like there's, for people that don't know about this, that it's requiring that foreign nonprofit organizations, when you're in China, you have to register, checking in with the Public Security Bureau, you have to have yearly plans. It's a lot of paperwork. But even for temporary visits to China, I haven't had a chance, with the COVID, I haven't had a chance to see how this works, but there is a lot of paperwork if I want to go and put on a meeting in China that I would have to do. And that has had, there's been a real cooling effect on some groups not wanting to continuing to engage in China. It's cut off some of the relationships between US foundations and NGOs that were supporting Chinese counterparts. So just, you know, so I want to make sure it's clear that obstacles for the non-governmental cooperation is not just, because of the gov to gov relationship has gone south. I don't know, you want to fill in some cracks there, Dean Mayer, that I left?
Well, sure. I mean, I agree with that. And, I agreed earlier, that the societal cooperation amongst in the sort of epistemic community, as we'd call it, of people who work on these issues, the subnational bureaucratic cooperation, these things do. That said, I do think that, governmental policy matters. And there was a difference between what happened in the Trump years and what is happening now in the Biden years. So these elections have consequences. And it's, so your question, Professor Zhao, is a good one. I mean, it is reasonable to question whether the U.S. can continue. You pointed to the temptation to vilify China, to make it a scapegoat. It is a very tempting thing in American politics right now, and it is really damaging. I mean, when it happens, as in the case of this legislation, it's very hard for China to ignore it. And of course, it's a provocation. So that's a problem. And I think the best we can do is try to contain that at this point, and leadership matters a lot in that space. On the other issue, I think the question of whether the U.S. can sustain its commitment to its stated targets of carbon neutrality by, I guess, with 2050 and other targets that we've set now. That's a challenge as well. But I guess that if I wanted to be hopeful about this, I would point to the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act was passed on, by the narrowest of margins in the Obama administration. And it has been under sustained attack ever since. And yet there it is. It's still there. And so I think the race is on right now to put in place policies that once in place will be hard to undo. The investments in infrastructure, for example, that support green energy, for example, once those are in place, it's going to be hard to unwind them. And so I think an optimistic view of things is that there'll be at least some things accomplished in the next couple of years that will endure no matter what happens in 2 years or 4 years. And then I do think the logic of this situation eventually will prevail in some ways, that the weight of public opinion and of interest in the society will sustain those things as well. I'll stop there.
Okay, so the Chinese side, those scholars, you talk about China's plans to meet those challenges.
Okay, probably I would say first, and then Professor Qi will talk about the coal issue or something. Yeah. For the specific plans, I would like to give a big picture first. By 2030, China's CO2 emissions will peak. There will be about 10.5 billion tons CO2 or something. By 2060, there will be 1.5 billion ton left, but 1 billion will be absorbed by carbon sink. Another 0.5 billion CO2 will be removed by CCUS. So the carbon neutrality will be achieved. For a specific plan to achieve carbon neutrality, I think first is China's political determination. Green development has been introduced into the constitution and has become a national development. So this is very important because it provides a certainty for investment. The second biggest policy is 5-year plan. You look, China has a 5-year plan every 5 years. Yeah, the 5-year plan is not just at a national level, but also at the industry level, local level. The 5-year plan sets the goal, timeline, action plan for the nation, for each province, and also for major firms. A third policy, I think, is to impose carbon constraints on the firms. Carbon has price. It will be taken into account the cost. Yeah, this will change the firm's behavior. Yeah. The fourth is the market function. Yeah. Because of the thanks to the carbon neutrality target, now the market gives a very clear signal. For instance, it's very hard for the coal-fired project to get financed because the market thinks it has no future. But if you look at the other side on new energy, electric vehicle, investment is very hot. Yeah. The fifth is transition justice. Yeah, Chinese government help industries growth to offset the negative impact from green transition. Yeah. With the specific policies in place, the carbon neutrality target could become a self-fulfilling process. Yeah. As we can say that on the one hand, China is reducing its fossil fuel and high carbon sectors. On the other hand, increase the low carbon economy, including new energy, electric vehicle. On that aspect, China is already one of the front runners in the world. Yeah. Professor Zhao.
Okay, Dr. Qi.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. Well, first of all, let me just make a quick correction of myself. When I said a month ago, the Strategic Competition Act was actually not passed the whole Senate. It was passed the Senate, the International Relations Committee. But it's probably quite likely to pass anyway. Yeah, just a quick response to Dean Mayer's comments on coal. Actually, I am one of the more optimistic person toward the coal issue. Indeed, coal is the major problem for carbon emission here in China and also in the world. But the good news is, ever since 2013, and when the Chinese coal consumption really, in my view, reached a peak, right, or a plateau. And ever since then, we have not seen in a single year that actually exceeded the coal consumption in 2013. Even last year, there is a major growth, very significant growth in coal consumption, but still, it's just about the same level at the level of 2013. And when you look at the share of coal in the overall primary energy consumption, 30 years ago, it was 3/4. And today it's last year it was 56.8%, a major drop. That means ever since 2013, the new addition to energy consumption is actually replaced with solar, wind, hydro, non-fossil fuel energy. I, for one, would expect this substitution effect will accelerate in the next couple of years, definitely in the next couple of decades. And Dean Mayer just also mentioned this concern about Belt and Road. I think it's a very, very legitimate concern, because if that happens, if China continues to support the coal-fired power plant along the Belt and Road, it will be a major problem worldwide. Again, the good news is China now is really promoting the so-called green finance. Well, at least ever since the 2016 when China hosted the G20 summit. That year, and green finance was made the major agenda item. Ever since that, this is even the standard is become more and more stringent. So no longer, in future, the coal-fired power plant or fossil fuel projects were considered to be a green project and supported with a green finance. In fact, and China now is also promoting, in particular, there's a climate financing. And this has become a very big issue, the encouraging both the public and the private banks, financial institutions to work put money into the climate financing. And I think this is have received just the overwhelming response from the private sector, from the investors. And we now see this has become a major concept in the financing sector. I think this is actually a good news. And the power plant in a coal-fired power plant in China, as soon as it's built, it become obsolete already. This is really a very big issue, but not a big issue for climate change. It's a big issue for the investors because these assets quickly became the stranded asset. So the investment community, they're talking about to formulate companies to deal with this bad asset themselves. So yes, a couple of years ago, we see when the restrictions was lifted for local government to approve the power plant, coal-fired power plant construction, there we see a boom. But it was that hopefully that was short term, and I think it's now the market itself is just speaking out. And now we're seeing the price for coal is very high. We're talking about $150 per ton. This is some of you probably can tell me the coal price in the United States, but I will doubt it can exceed such a price. I think on this front, the price is working. The market is working. Just responding to Professor Zhao's earlier question, is a carbon credit or carbon market in general, and is going to be in operation within 1 month. Within a month, a nationwide carbon market will be in operation by the end of June this year. And when that is established, that will cover 40%. Well, we're talking about 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So that will be the biggest carbon market worldwide. And we hope to see a high enough price in order for this market to work and in reducing the carbon emissions for the power sector. Already, the government exploring the next sector to be incorporated into the carbon market, the construction, the building sector you just mentioned earlier. So this will be the next sector to be incorporated, and hopefully, we'll see the market will work. It will fix this the so-called the biggest market failure of our age. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have a final round of conversation, then we can open up to the audience. Let me raise this round question. For the Chinese colleagues, although China now is the largest emitter of carbon costile, but per capita emission is far behind the US. In fact, it's even below average of OECD countries. And also China's per capita income is very low too. So China will continue to develop its economy because it's still, I mean, the second largest economy, but per capita is very low. So this economic development, continued economic development would have major implications for the climate change, for the energy consumption, everything. So how could China to continue its economic growth while to keep its commitment on the climate change front? So that's for the Chinese side. The economic development for China is so important. So how these two could be reconciled in this process? For the American colleagues here, the question becomes is that although the climate change is very high in Joe Biden administration agenda, but the competition with China is equally high in the foreign policy agenda. How could the U.S. to reconcile this competition in the geostrategic fronts, human rights fronts, many other issues with the possible collaboration on the climate change front? In fact, there's a mentality, I think, in the American politicians, among politicians, that is a zero-sum competition. Even Joe Biden talking about the electricity car, he talked about we'll catch up China. It's just like a kind of to race to not to the best, but just to defeat the other side. So that's the mentality. How can we overcome those mentality? In fact, this also related to the China side, how the US will respond to that. The climate change on the Chinese side is not as high in the foreign policy and domestic policy agenda as the United States. And China has linked other issues, human rights issue, Xinjiang issue, and South China Sea issue, Taiwan issue, many other issues to the climate change collaboration. So how could US in that context work with China? So let's start from the Chinese colleagues talking about economic growth and climate change. And also domestic stability. I think Dr. Qi mentioned that if economic growth slows down, political stability will be at stake.
Okay, since you just mentioned, let me just get started. I think this narrative of responsibility itself was particularly highlighted, 20, even 10 years ago. I think the narrative has changed a lot, right? And 30 years ago, we were talking about common but differentiated responsibility principle. And 10 years ago, almost you don't really hear anyone mentioning the CBDR anymore. Well, there are a lot of reasons behind that. I think what happened, as I mentioned earlier, is we now realize that actions on climate change is not necessarily affecting the economic growth. Let me just quickly give us a timeline. 20 years ago, 2001, when President George Bush was citing this narrative, climate change action will hurt the economic growth. I think that was actually true. Then 2007, in the Stern Review, effectively changed the narrative. Well, while acknowledging the action on climate change will actually affect the economic growth, and Stern very eloquently built a case that lack of action on climate change will result in more loss to the climate damages. When you compare the effect of climate action on economic growth and the potential loss, and you compare the two, you find no action is not a viable option, right? No action will means even more loss, okay? A couple of years after that, 2014, this new climate economy group developed a new narrative, as better climate, better growth, right? So the two can actually go side by side. Today, this narrative is even more changed, and by action on climate change is a new driver for economic growth. I think this is exactly what China is looking at. The Chinese government is looking at. We're taking these actions on climate change and actions on public health, and as an opportunity to transform our economic growth model into a new one. We need this new one is going to be green, it's going to be low carbon, and it is going to be good for the public health. So this is the new narrative. So in the United States, people often say all politics are local, but it is often not easy to realize. All economy are political, right? This is in China. This green economy is probably the biggest politics of our time. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be losers and the winners. Yes, then so what? Then just let it happen, right? Let it just people who decide to stick to the old economy, the old fossil fuel based economy, will lose, and people who will make their mind to transform to a new green economy will be the winner. This is good. This is going to be good for the whole society and for the whole humanity. I think this is that is the politics that being played out right now. Then I think this is then of course we need to protect the weak, the disadvantages population in this transition. But this transition is actually happening. It is actually happening. So overall economic growth will eventually benefit from this transition. Well, that's the new shared belief already being developed right now. I think that is the way to address this trade-off between economic growth and climate change action.
Dr. Zhang, you want to say anything?
Okay. I would like to add something to echo Professor Qi. Actually, I already partly addressed this question in my opening remarks here. Basically, this is an issue about the relation between environment and development. Conventionally, the mainstream idea is that if you need to grow your economy, you have to somehow sacrifice your environment until your economy grows to a certain level. This is the so-called pollute first, clean up later pathway or environmental Kurzweil's curve. But this is not a law of economic development. Now, basically, China thinks that the green transition can actually drive its economy to a more competitive structure. So strategically, China see the transition as an opportunity rather than a burden. Though the green transition is the challenge of the transition is unprecedented. Yeah, Professor Zhao.
Okay, good. Dean Meyer and Dr. Turner.
Should I try it first? Was really around balancing climate change cooperation with the increasing or highly salient competitive dynamic that's underway, and it's a real problem. When I was young, the U.S. biggest competitor was the USSR, and we were locked in the Cold War. And then there was a period when we were fixated on Japan. We were sure that Japan was number one, and we were locked in a fierce battle with Japan. And unfortunately, in U.S. politics, and as you, Dr. Zhao, mentioned at the beginning, even in public discourse and the kind of anti-Asian sentiment that has bubbled up, it's been all too tempting to make China the scapegoat on many dimensions. Now, some of this is real. There's real concerns about, that is to say, there are significant issues around security, status of Taiwan, Hong Kong, human rights, et cetera. We could talk about those things, but there's also, absurd statements about the COVID virus, for example. And so these things play out in American politics, and they do constrain, the Congress, and they, and so it's an issue. I think the thrust of what I was wanting to say earlier was that, yes, that's true, and let's call it the high politics, things that require congressional votes and that are highly salient in the media, unfortunately, at the moment, are very difficult. But as has been discussed, there's so many other dynamics at work here in the evolving green technology sector, in the even in green finance, as was said, China is certainly well ahead of the U.S. in that regard, but also the U.S. is now realizing that it should be doing more of that as well. In the cooperation, as we've mentioned several times now, between governments at the intergovernmental level, and then I think ultimately at the societal level, as has also been pointed out, as this consensus about this new narrative. I write about stories. So, we make sense of something like climate change through relatively simple stories of one kind or another, and it matters. And so the news story in which development and climate action are not in competition with each other is increasingly the case, and in the U.S. as well. It's not universal yet, but I think it's increasingly the case. So I think last thing I guess I'd say, just I write about negotiations, and one of the first people write about two-level games. So if you think of this as an international game and a domestic game, one of the challenges in the U.S. system is that we find it very difficult to compensate the losers. So when they're losers and winners, our system is designed in many ways to enable the losers to block action and to prevent action at the international level now. So that's a frustrating thing for many people in dealing with the United States, because relatively small factions can often prevent the U.S. from moving ahead. That will be an ongoing challenge to overcome some of the entrenched interests in the U.S. that continue to block action. But on the whole, over time, at least on the longer trajectory, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. We're going to go swimming. Okay. Let's think about how, just an example where the bilateral direct stuff maybe isn't going to work in the near term. Well, just recently, Biden, among the flurry of climate initiatives, the do everything on lowering CO2 emissions, Biden has been pushing the International Maritime Organization to adopt zero emission shipping, a zero emission goal for ships. And I mean, if ships are, it's around, maybe it sounds small, like 3% of the CO2 emissions, but also a huge amount of, with the diesel fuels, the air pollution, and, and that affects people's health in port cities. In fact, US and China, they had for like 10, 12 years, had a US-China green port initiative. And the port of LA and the port of Shanghai, I think they were working together, and the government said, "Ooh, this could be a thing," right? So that, but they were exchanging, lessons on how like the Port of LA had started early on to when ships came in, they had to turn off the diesel and then they plug into the shore, right? It's just like a plug, boom, you plug it into the shore so you can, it lowers both the climate greenhouse gas emissions and the air pollution. And I got to bring one of Ministry of Transportation researcher to Port of LA where he kind of knew the guys. And he gave a talk about how, this exchange had led them to make, they were making lots of changes in the ports in China in terms of natural gas fueled unloading and loading equipment. They were requiring lower, higher quality SO2 emissions that would come out of the boats. And the port officials in LA said, man, they're moving fast. And so it was kind of a great, so these are the professionals. And I kind of want to break people's thinking that it's not just what Washington and Beijing are saying, but that by setting, but again, Washington and Beijing can set, they can again be the match that lights things. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but that, triggers changes. And in that statement, that the Shea and Kerry statement, lowering emissions from maritime activities, also civil aviation. But one thing I want to inject in here, because we had a good question from Laura Madden, and I know that Dr. Zhang wanted to talk about this too, the question of green agriculture, where we are on that. I'm going to say one thing and I'm going to mute myself. You ready, Dr. Zhang? So besides greening, maybe thinking of low carbon ag within each of our countries, there's also the big challenge. The US and China and Europe are big agricultural commodity importers from Latin America. And we are fueling deforestation. Cutting down trees is not good for the climate. So the soy, the leather, the beef. The US and Europe are starting to come together on ways that we could regulate the agricultural commodities to protect timber. And, I can see the dynamic with the Europeans and the Americans coming together, writing national legislation, that this is a way, again, it's not exactly pressure, but we start setting global norms, and that could also help, pull China in to it. So it's again, and I know it was mentioned by a number of speakers today, it's not just a G2 situation, US and China on climate. Let's bring the European, it's a bigger bed, it's a bigger, sphere. Dr. Zhang, I know you wanted to talk a bit about ag, and I think it would be, we're talking to people in the heartland. We should talk about ag.
Yeah, in fact, we have two specialists on green agriculture from Beijing. They are discussants. But Dr. Zhang, you can talk first, then we bring these two green agriculture specialists. You're muted.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll briefly talk about the agriculture issue. So agriculture is impacted by climate change, but it is also part of the problem, since agriculture is also a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. First of all, I hope that the zero emission agriculture goal set by President Biden could be achieved in the US. But I think this is extremely difficult since we need to keep in mind that the reason why agricultural emission is so high is because that the so-called modern agriculture is oil-based agriculture, which is called industrial agriculture, chemical agriculture, and monoculture. Agricultural structure and dietary pattern is animal products based. So methane is a major greenhouse gas emissions. So if you don't substantially change the agriculture model, don't change the lifestyle, don't change the dietary pattern, for instance, eating too much meat, it will be very hard to realize net zero emission agriculture. For the issue of if China could agricultural modernization could reduce or increase its emission, I think it depends. It depends on the way of modernization it takes. If it takes the American agriculture way, it will be very hard. Now, most of the agriculture in China has turned into chemical agriculture in the American style. So agriculture needs a certain, in my view, needs a second green revolution. The first green revolution in 1950s, it has significantly increased the agricultural productivity, but it has brought about a serious environmental problem and the biodiversity problem. The second green revolution will lead is to make it sustainable. Yeah, now there are two complementary ways to achieve the second green revolution. Yeah. The first is to use high technology in agriculture, for instance, the precision agriculture, internet-based agriculture. The new technology can effectively reduce the agricultural emissions, but it is also expensive. Yeah. The second way is to translate chemical agriculture into ecological agriculture, for instance, organic agriculture. So what is more fundamental is that we need to change our dietary pattern, change our lifestyle. The so-called modern dietary pattern is too much based on animal products. We eat too much, we may eat too much animal products. It is not good for our health, not good for our environmental. Yeah, Professor Zhao.
Okay, thank you. And we have two agricultural specialists from China Agricultural University. I will not introduce their bios, just give their name, Professor Zhao Jing and Professor Zhao Chuang. So if you are there, can you make a brief remarks about the green agriculture in China?
Hi.
Dr. Zhao Jing, yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but not very clear. Can you can go ahead and speak, yeah.
So now, okay. How about can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the Professor Zhao. My name is Jing Zhao, and I'm working as associate professor in China Agricultural University. And also we have a colleague, we are in the same office, so we can give our opinion together. So our research area is about the climate change and agriculture in China. And just now, Dr. Zhang give some introductions about the Chinese agriculture, because we are our research area is about the real agriculture, not about the agricultural economic, agricultural politics and so on. So we are only studying the real agriculture, like our research is focused on the food security and climate change. So the agriculture system is very complicated. Sometimes we would like to have more food production, but we have to include a lot of the water and the fertilization and so on. So it's very important for us to find the balance between the environment and the food production. So in China, the cropping system is different from the United States, because we have a very limited land, but we have a large population. So in most of the Chinese Chinese land, the farmland, we have a multiple cropping system, which means in the same in one land we grow 2 or 3 seasons of the crop. And because of the climate change,
we lost you.
Yeah, we can't hear you anymore.
In that case, while you are working on your system, let's move to Dr. Zhao Chuang. Dr. Zhao Chuang, are you there?
The microphone is
connection is not good.
the microphone is okay. Hello everyone. My name is Huang Zhao, and I'm also from China Agricultural University. And my research is mainly on the climate change and agriculture and crop yield. So my view is that because agriculture has a lot of crops, including major grain crops and other root vegetables, and also fish and forest. So in totally, agriculture now is thought as a carbon source during the whole industry. So in my views, improves agriculture, water and nitrogen management, and improves animal management and pasture management, and also the grass and reduce grassland destroyed, and might also increase the agriculture and forest combined system that might be, I think, very effective to reduce the methane and the nitrous oxide source. So the other aspect might be change the land use method, and through the cultivar development, and improve the technology, and finally increase our crop productivity, so that we can increase the carbon sink. Third one is the sustainability. For example, we can transfer from the old energy to the new biological energy. So I think that's a main method we can do to reduce the agriculture's emissions. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Because the time is about over, so we have several dozens of questions that showed how important this issue is to our community. But I don't think we can answer all those questions. Let me pick up only one question, a simple question to all the panelists. That is, how could the green energy or green technology sustain the sustainable growth? Do we have enough those green technology jobs or the resources for continued economic growth to replace the fossil energies? I think that's the question. I did not read it, but that's what I remembered. The question that we have so many questions. Will there be enough renewable energies to support the sustainable economic growth? It's technical, but
well, one thing, I mean, I think that it probably not if we can't do more energy efficiency, right? I mean, I think Dr. Chu, you'd agree that, I mean, there's, because really the energy efficiency, which to be honest is it's not very sexy. It's like, using less energy is not like a solar panel and other technologies, but it really is that would make it more possible. In fact, that really needs to get much more attention in both countries. And I mentioned the building sector in particular, but also think of the construction sector, steel, cement, they need to be more efficient. Chie, but I don't know if one of you has something else to add.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The energy savings, the energy efficiency is really the most important way of reducing carbon at this moment. 10 years ago, when the World Bank developed their World Development Report, they cite one figure that I quote here. If we simply switch the from the high energy consuming SUVs, big SUVs in the United States to the smaller cars, the carbon that's saved, from that one action is equivalent to all the emissions from the coal-fired power plant from the entire Southeast Asia plus Africa plus Latin America. So that's a very high potential. But to answer your question, Professor Zhao, do we have enough renewable energy? Yes, we have 1,000 times of renewable energy that as we would need for the entire world in terms of overall quantity. But do we have enough technology? No. As I mentioned, that roughly half of the technologies are still need to be invented, developed, innovated in the next few decades. I think that is the one major area of challenge. And I think that is really exciting opportunities for all the young people, young students who are listening and attending this discussion. I think just go for it, right? So we need your talents, we need your energy to come up with these technologies, and we need to work together. Okay.
Anyone want to jump in? If not, I think we are exactly on the schedule. And to conclude this, I want each panelist to have 1 or 2 sentences to see if we can, if the US and China could collaborate to meet the climate change challenge or climate change itself.
Again, maybe not warm embrace, but there definitely has to be, it's like parallel play, that both countries, that we set the agenda, the global norms. If we don't act, 完蛋了.
Okay, 完蛋了. Okay. Meyer, you pessimistic or optimistic?
No, I'm optimistic in the long run. I mean, we have to do it. It is actually in each of our interests to do it. And it's been said, some of the old apparent trade-offs aren't there anymore. To answer your previous question, I also am optimistic. Yes, we need new technologies, but there's not a trade-off really ultimately between, for example, as often said, jobs and so will there be enough jobs? Yes, there will be enough jobs. We always find things to do, and if we're not wasting energy, then we have better things to do. So I am in the long run cautiously optimistic. I'll stop there, but we should recognize what a massive transformation it is. Getting Americans not to drive SUVs and to stop eating beef is not that easy.
Okay, Dr. Zhang.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the green transition is not a burden, but an opportunity. The collaboration between US and China has enormous opportunities. I hope in the future, we have more conversation like today. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Qi, you have last words.
Yeah, I just repeat on bilateral cooperation between the two countries. Definitely, we should and we could. It is extremely challenging, but nothing is impossible.
With that very positive note, let's conclude our very exciting discussion. I want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and also for all those who have participated in this discussion, and thank the US Heartland China Association and the Carter Center and our own dean here for the school support. and have a good morning those in Asia and good evening in North America. And
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Remember,
Bye.
glass half full.
Bye.